Close your eyes for a moment and think about a sailor. Not just any sailor, a young man, maybe 23 years old, standing on the deck of a warship in the dead of night. His name was Antonio. He had a wife back home, a daughter he'd never met, born 3 months after he sailed away. In his pocket, he carried a letter he'd written but never sent, telling them he'd be home by summer. He stood there, breathing in the salt air, unaware that in less than 10 minutes, his ship would be engulfed in flames so fierce that the sea itself would seem to boil. He would never make it home. His daughter would grow up knowing her father only through stories and a faded portrait. His wife would wait by the harbor every summer for years, hoping against hope. But on this night, as Antonio stood watch, he had no idea that someone had already decided his fate. Somewhere in the darkness, an enemy fleet was approaching, silent, deliberate, carrying fire that would erase an entire naval power from existence before the sun could rise. This is not just a story about war. This is about the moment when centuries of naval dominance ended in 10 minutes of pure chaos and flame. And if you skip this story now, you're not just missing history. You're forgetting Antonio and the thousands like him who never got to say goodbye. Subscribe now, because their sacrifice deserves to be remembered, and what happened next changed the course of naval warfare forever. The year was 1696, and the world's oceans were a battleground of empires. The Mediterranean Sea, that ancient cradle of civilization, had become a theater of endless conflict between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire. For decades, the balance of power had shifted back and forth like the tides themselves, with neither side able to deliver a decisive blow. But in the spring of that year, something was about to change, something so audacious, so perfectly executed, that military historians would study it for centuries to come. The setting was the Bay of Chios, a harbor on the Aegean coast that had served as a crucial Ottoman naval base for generations. The bay was a natural fortress, protected by high cliffs on 3 sides and a narrow entrance that could be easily defended. Inside this seemingly impregnable sanctuary lay the pride of the Ottoman fleet, a collection of warships that represented years of construction, countless resources, and the naval might of one of the world's greatest empires. There were galleys with rows of oars extending like the legs of water spiders, massive sailing ships with cannon ports running along their sides, supply vessels loaded with ammunition and provisions, and smaller craft that darted between the larger ships like attendants serving royalty. The Ottoman navy had grown complacent. After so many years of dominance in these waters, they had begun to believe their own legend. The admirals had started to relax their guard, convinced that no enemy would dare attack such a well-defended position. The entrance to the bay was narrow enough that a handful of ships could defend it against a much larger force. The cliffs provided natural watchtowers where sentries could spot approaching vessels from miles away, and the sheer number of ships in the harbor meant that any attacker would face overwhelming firepower if they tried to force their way in. It seemed like the perfect defensive position, a place where the Ottoman fleet could rest, resupply, and prepare for their next campaign without fear of interference. But there was one man who saw weakness where others saw strength. His name was Francesco Morosini, a Venetian admiral whose reputation for cunning had made him both feared and respected throughout the Mediterranean. Morosini was not a young man. He was in his 70s, but age had not diminished his strategic mind. If anything, decades of naval combat had sharpened his instincts to a razor's edge. He had studied the Ottoman fleet for years, learning their patterns, their habits, their weaknesses. And he had come to a realization that would change everything. The very things that made the Bay of Chios seem impregnable were actually vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. The narrow entrance that limited how many attacking ships could enter at once also meant that the Ottoman vessels inside were trapped. The high cliffs that provided natural watchtowers also created blind spots where the darkness of night would be absolute. And the concentration of so many ships in one place meant that fire, the ancient enemy of every sailor, would spread with devastating speed if it ever got started. Morosini began to formulate a plan, one so dangerous that even his own officers thought he had lost his mind when he first explained it. He was going to send ships directly into the heart of the Ottoman fleet, not to fight, but to burn. The concept of the fire ship was not new. For centuries, navies had used vessels loaded with combustible materials as weapons, setting them ablaze and steering them toward enemy fleets. But fire ships were notoriously difficult to control and often failed to reach their targets. They were considered a weapon of desperation, something you tried when conventional tactics had already failed. What Morosini was proposing was different. He wanted to use multiple fire ships in a coordinated attack, timed precisely to create maximum chaos and destruction. He wanted to turn the entire Bay of Chaos into an inferno. The preparation took weeks. Morosini selected several older vessels from his fleet, ships that were no longer fit for combat, but were still seaworthy enough to make one final voyage. These would be his fire ships. His men stripped them of everything valuable, then began the careful work of transforming them into floating bombs. They packed the holds with barrels of pitch, a sticky substance that burned with intense heat and was nearly impossible to extinguish. They added bundles of dry wood, carefully arranged to ensure maximum air flow and rapid burning. They included containers of sulfur, which would create thick, choking smoke. And most ingeniously, they rigged up a system of fuses and timed charges that would ensure the fires started at precisely the right moment. But the fire ships were only part of the plan. Morosini knew that surprise was everything. If the Ottomans detected the attack too early, they would have time to scatter their fleet or prepare defensive measures. So he planned the assault for a night with no moon, when the darkness would be absolute. He chose a time when intelligence reports suggested the Ottoman crews would be ashore or asleep, when vigilance would be at its lowest. And he selected volunteer crews for the fire ships, men who would sail these vessels right up to the Ottoman fleet, light the fuses, and then escape in small boats at the last possible moment. The volunteers knew they might not make it back. Sailing a ship loaded with explosives and flammable materials toward an enemy fleet in complete darkness was essentially a suicide mission. If the fuses were timed wrong, they could be caught in the explosion. If the Ottomans spotted them too early, they would be blown out of the water. If their escape boats capsized in the chaos, they would drown or burn. Yet when Morosini called for volunteers, more men stepped forward than he needed. These were sailors who understood what was at stake, who had lost friends and comrades to Ottoman guns, who believed that one bold strike could change the course of the war. As the chosen night approached, tension aboard the Venetian ships became almost unbearable. The men checked and rechecked their equipment. The fire ship crews said quiet goodbyes to their friends, trying not to think too hard about what they were about to do. Morosini himself spent the final hours in his cabin, going over every detail of the plan, searching for flaws or oversights. He knew that timing was everything. Launch the attack too early, and the darkness wouldn't be deep enough to hide their approach. Launch it too late, and the first light of dawn would expose them. Everything had to be perfect. The night arrived cold and clear, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet, but no moon to illuminate the sea. The Venetian fleet moved into position several miles from the Bay of Chaos, hidden by the darkness and the curve of the coast. The fire ships, looking deceptively normal in the starlight, were positioned at the front. Behind them, ready to provide cover if needed, were the main Venetian warships. And in small boats alongside the fire ships were the crews who would sail them to their doom and then, if fortune smiled, escape to tell the tale. Morosini gave the signal. The fire ships began to move, their sails barely visible against the night sky. They sailed slowly, cautiously, making as little noise as possible. The men at the helms were experienced sailors, chosen because they could navigate by instinct and starlight alone. Behind them, in the small boats, came the escape crews, rowing quietly to keep pace. The distance to the bay entrance was several miles, and every moment seemed to stretch into eternity. The sailors could hear their own heartbeats, the creak of rope and wood, the whisper of water against hulls. Any sound could give them away. As they approached the narrow entrance to the bay, the tension became almost physical. This was the moment of greatest danger. If the Ottoman sentries were alert, if a guard happened to be looking in the right direction, the entire plan would collapse. The fire ships would be sitting targets, unable to maneuver in the narrow channel. But the night remained quiet. The Ottoman fleet slept, confident in their safety, unaware that death was gliding silently toward them on the dark water. The fire ships passed through the entrance one by one, silent as ghosts. Once inside the bay, the volunteer crews could see the Ottoman fleet spread out before them, dozens of ships anchored close together, their masts rising like a forest against the stars. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. So many ships, so much power, all of it about to be destroyed. The fire ship crews steered their vessels toward the heart of the Ottoman formation, positioning each ship to cause maximum damage. They moved between the anchored vessels, threading through narrow gaps, getting as close as possible before lighting the fuses. Then came the moment they had all been waiting for and dreading. The lead fire ship crew struck their flint and lit the first fuse. Immediately, they abandoned ship, tumbling into their small boat and rowing desperately away. Within seconds, the other fire ships followed suit. Sparks flew in the darkness as fuses caught and began to burn. The volunteer crews rowed for their lives, racing against time and fire, their arms burning with effort, their hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. For a few minutes, nothing seemed to happen. The fuses burned silently, hidden in the depths of the ships. The Ottoman fleet continued to sleep. Then, with a sound like thunder, the first fire ship exploded. Flames erupted from its deck, shooting 50 feet into the air. The ship seemed to come apart all at once, scattering burning debris in every direction. Pieces of flaming wood landed on nearby Ottoman vessels, setting their sails and rigging ablaze. The pitch barrels ruptured, spreading liquid fire across the water itself. And before anyone could react, the second fire ship exploded, then the third, then the fourth. The Bay of Chaos became hell on earth. The initial explosions woke the Ottoman crews, who stumbled on deck to find their world on fire. Flames spread from ship to ship with terrifying speed, jumping across the narrow gaps between vessels. The pitch burned with such intense heat that would ignite it just from proximity. Sails caught fire and collapsed, draping burning canvas across decks and men. The sulfur smoke became so thick that sailors couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Men jumped into the water to escape the flames, only to find that the water itself was burning where the pitch had spread. The Ottoman admirals, roused from sleep by the explosions, tried to organize a response. But there was nothing they could do. The ships were anchored too close together. There wasn't time to raise anchors and maneuver away from the flames. The narrow entrance that had seemed like such a defensive advantage now trapped them inside the inferno. Those ships that did manage to cut their anchor lines and attempt escape found themselves running into other vessels in the smoke and darkness, creating more collisions, more opportunities for fire to spread. The volunteer Venetian crews, rowing frantically away from the chaos they had created, looked back to see the entire bay lit up like daylight. Ship after ship caught fire, each one adding to the conflagration. The heat was so intense that they could feel it on their faces even from a distance. The sound was overwhelming. The roar of flames, the crack of exploding powder magazines, the screams of dying men, the crash of masts falling. It was a symphony of destruction, and it played for hours. Morosini, watching from his flagship at the bay entrance, could hardly believe what he was seeing. The plan had worked beyond his wildest expectations. The fire was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Ottoman ships that had seemed untouchable just hours ago were now blazing torches, lighting up the night sky. The admiral who had been called reckless, whose plan had been deemed too dangerous, was witnessing the complete annihilation of an enemy fleet. And it had taken less than 10 minutes from the first explosion to the point where the fire became unstoppable. By dawn, when the sun finally rose over the Bay of Chaos, the destruction was total. Where there had once been a proud fleet of warships, there was now only burning wreckage and charred timber floating on oily water. The Ottoman Navy had lost more than 30 major vessels in a single night. Thousands of sailors had died, burned, or drowned in the chaos. The survivors who made it ashore were traumatized, many of them injured, all of them in shock. The naval base that had seemed impregnable had been utterly destroyed, and with it, Ottoman naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean. The Venetian losses, by contrast, were minimal. All of the volunteer fire ship crews had made it back safely, though several had narrow escapes from the spreading flames. Not a single Venetian warship had been damaged. The entire operation had been a textbook example of asymmetric warfare, using cunning and surprise to defeat a numerically superior enemy. News of the disaster spread throughout the Ottoman Empire like the fire itself. The Sultan was furious, demanding to know how such a catastrophe could have occurred. Admirals were executed, commanders were demoted, and the entire naval command structure was reorganized. But no amount of punishment could undo the damage. The Ottoman fleet had been crippled, and it would take years to rebuild. More importantly, the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Ottoman naval power was shattered. If the mighty fleet at Chios could be destroyed in a single night, then nowhere was truly safe. The attack had consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate military impact. Ottoman control over trade routes weakened, allowing Venetian and other European merchants to expand their operations. Coastal cities that had lived in fear of Ottoman raids began to breathe easier. The balance of power in the Mediterranean began to shift, slowly but inexorably, away from the Ottoman Empire and toward the European naval powers. Naval tacticians across Europe studied Morosini's plan, recognizing that he had demonstrated a new kind of warfare, one that relied on precision, timing, and psychological impact rather than brute force. The fire ship attack also changed how navies thought about harbor defense. The very concentration of ships that had seemed like a show of strength was now recognized as a vulnerability. Naval bases began to spread their ships out more, to establish better watch systems, to prepare contingency plans for fire. The age-old terror of fire at sea, which sailors had always feared, was now weaponized in a way that made every anchored fleet a potential target. The psychological impact was enormous. No fleet could rest easy in harbor anymore. For Morosini himself, the victory at Chios secured his reputation as one of the greatest naval commanders of his age. He was celebrated throughout Venice, his name spoken with reverence. But the old admiral took little personal pleasure in the triumph. He had seen too much war, too much death. He knew that the burning ships had held men like Antonio, sailors with families waiting at home, ordinary people caught up in the great game of empires. Victory tasted of ash and smoke.
The true genius of Morosini's plan lay not in its complexity, but in its simplicity. He had identified a single critical vulnerability, the concentration of enemy ships in a confined space, and had exploited it with absolute precision. He had used the enemy's own defensive advantages against them, turning the narrow entrance and high cliffs from assets into liabilities. He had understood that in warfare, sometimes the boldest plan is the most effective, that surprise and audacity can overcome superior numbers and firepower. And he had demonstrated that 10 minutes of carefully planned chaos could accomplish what years of conventional naval combat could not. The Bay of Chios attack remains one of history's most devastating single-night naval actions. It proved that technological advantage and numerical superiority mean nothing if an enemy can strike at the right place and the right time with overwhelming surprise. It showed that fire, humanity's oldest weapon, could still be decisive in an age of cannon and gunpowder. And it demonstrated that the courage of a few volunteers, willing to sail ships filled with explosives into the heart of an enemy fleet, could change the course of history. Years later, when naval historians analyzed the attack, they marveled at how every element had come together perfectly. The intelligence that identified the target, the timing that chose the moonless night, the volunteer crews who executed the plan flawlessly, the fire ships loaded with just the right combination of materials to create an unstoppable inferno, the Ottoman complacency that left them vulnerable. Remove any single element, and the plan might have failed. But Morosini had orchestrated every detail with the precision of a master composer, and the result was a symphony of destruction that lasted 10 minutes, but echoed through centuries. Today, the Bay of Chios is quiet, a peaceful harbor where fishing boats bob on gentle waves. But if you know where to look, you can still find remnants of that terrible night. Divers have discovered burned timber on the sea floor, warped metal from ship fittings melted by intense heat, and anchors from vessels that never sailed again. These artifacts are silent witnesses to the night when an entire fleet died in flames, when the sea itself seemed to burn, when the course of naval history changed in 10 minutes of fire and chaos. Antonio's letter, the one he carried in his pocket but never sent, was found weeks later, washed up on a beach miles from the bay. The paper was water-damaged and partially burned, but the words were still readable. He had written about his daughter, about how he imagined her smile, about his plans for when he returned home. He had written about the peaceful life he dreamed of, far from war and the sea. The letter eventually made its way to his widow, who kept it for the rest of her life, a reminder of the man she had loved and the future they would never have. She never remarried. She raised their daughter alone, telling her stories about her father, about his bravery and his kindness. And every year, on the anniversary of that terrible night, she would go to the harbor and throw flowers into the water, a memorial for a man who never came home. The attack on the Bay of Chios teaches us that in warfare, as in life, the boldest moves often yield the greatest results. That surprise and timing can overcome any defense. That sometimes, to win decisively, you must risk everything on a single throw of the dice. Morosini gambled the lives of his volunteers, the reputation of his fleet, and his own legacy on one night of fire and fury. And he won. But the price of that victory, counted in human lives and suffering, reminds us that even the most brilliant military success is built on tragedy. For every strategic triumph, there are countless personal disasters. For every admiral celebrated in history books, there are thousands of sailors whose names we will never know, whose stories ended in fire and water, whose dreams died with them in the darkness. This is why we remember. Not just to celebrate clever tactics or study military strategy, but to honor the human cost of war. To remember Antonio and the thousands like him, who never got to say goodbye, who never got to go home, who died serving causes they might not have fully understood in conflicts that history would eventually forget. Their sacrifice deserves more than a footnote. It deserves our attention, our respect, and our commitment to remember. Because if we forget them, if we reduce them to mere statistics in a military engagement, then we lose something essential about our humanity. We lose the ability to see past the grand strategies and the historical significance to the individual tragedies that make up the true cost of war. So subscribe, not just to learn about battles and tactics, but to remember the people who fought them, to keep their stories alive, to ensure that their sacrifices are not forgotten. Because history is not just about dates and events. It is about people who loved and feared and hoped and died. People like Antonio, who carried a letter he never sent, who dreamed of a daughter he would never meet, who stood on a deck in the darkness, never knowing that he had only minutes left to live. Remember them, honor them, and never forget that behind every great moment in history, there are countless small tragedies that deserve to be told.